and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you? Or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon run a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of their 3 writing houses, to pay-what-you-can online events and online masterclasses that delve deep into craft over the course of 2 hours. Their courses cover everything from commercial, genre, and experimental fiction to poetry, screenwriting, and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak with the novelist Joe Nesbø.
We spoke to Joe about writing his first book, The Bat, in 5 weeks while already established as a musician, about his anti-hero, Harry Hole, and about his latest novel, The Night House.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Joe, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Could we start with The Night House, the story of a teenage boy called Richard who's sent to live with his aunt and uncle in the wake of his parents' death, and then when youngsters start going missing, he's put on the hook for it. Where did the idea come from?
I'm not sure. I never know where my ideas come from. They seem to pop up at around 5 o'clock in the morning when I wake up and I'm, in that state, half between sleeping and awake. It's like the guard is down. My critical sense doesn't work, so it means that all kinds of crazy and really bad ideas are let through. So I probably developed the idea in bed that is probably the best thing about being a writer, that you can, stay in bed and call it work.
And could you tell us a little bit about how you go about constructing plot? So a question that we put to all novelists on the show is whether they're, in the vocabulary that we often use, a plotter or a plunger. So whether they're someone who has worked everything out in advance, or whether they just kind of dive in and follow your nose. And we saw this quite interesting comment that you'd made saying that I am the captain on the ship. I like the feeling when writing chapter 1 that I can tell my readers, come sit closer, listen carefully. I have this great story to tell you and I know exactly where we're going. What is your process in that respect?
Well, first of all, I don't really have a method. It's not like when I come up with the idea for a story, it's not like, I have any system for how to go about it really. But there is one basic rule. I do write synopsises. So I'm probably in the category of a plotter then. I do like to really build the story bottom up, meaning what is the basic idea, what is the bottom. That could be that could be the title of a novel. It could be a character. It could be an idea for like the perfect murder, or just a scene that I find that it is double or triple layered in a way, that there's a subtext to a certain scene so I know that key scene is going to be in a novel. Stanley Kubrick, I think he worked in that way, that he had like 7 key scenes that he wanted in his movie, and then he wrote a script trying to fit the pieces together, the scenes together, and sometimes I will work like that too, but it all comes down to it being a story with a logic to it and with a gravity to it. On the other hand, it's created using gut feeling. more than, the plotting brain. So I work a bit like comedians. I think I once asked a comedian who's known for being very analytic about his jokes, and he said, "Yeah, you can be analytical, and in my case, you need to be. But if it doesn't make bubbles in your stomach, as he put it, it isn't a good joke." And I think it's the same with me. If it doesn't, cause me being curious about something or scared about something or steer some emotion, it really doesn't work. Doesn't matter how good the plot is.
And do you find that in the writing, you're still able to feel that sense of suspense and anticipation, even though you know what's going to happen?
I go through various phases. There's the first phase when you come up with the idea. And that is much like when writing songs. When you have rehearsed the song and gone through the song, the first basic idea 30, 40 times, you kind of lose the sense of what the music or the riff was about. So you had to kind of remember and trust the feeling you had the first time you heard it. And it's the same with the idea for a book. You have to sort of be able to either return to that feeling or trust that your gut feeling was right the first time.
And then with The Night House, with the new novel, what was it about a kind of coming-of-age story that interested you?
I think that it's, when you look at the tradition of horror stories, I like to stay within the boundaries of tradition, whether it's the crime novel or pop songs, or in this case, horror stories. The tradition seems to be that there are young people involved. I don't know why. Maybe the innocence of young people, the capacity for being scared, that seems to slightly diminish with age. It's something about thinking back. In my youth, I was probably more scared then than I am now. But it's also, of course, the innocence. I mean, the tradition of the crime story, American horror movies, is that if you have had sex before marriage, you are going to get killed. So it is, of course, that rule too, that sort of innocence, that virginity is rewarded in the American horror story. I don't know if that is true in this story, but it's I have all those rules in the back of my head, and I love those. I love pop songs, stupid 3.5 minutes pop songs, old pop songs, and old horror movies. I think that if you look at the TV series like Stranger Things, they are doing the same thing. They are using the cliches of the horror stories and making it fun, and that's probably what I'm doing in The Night House also. It's scary, but it's also fun, hopefully.
And how do you develop characters, perhaps using the example of Richard? Is that something that comes to you at 5 a.m. as well?
Well, developing characters, I find that I have to make them walk and talk. I can plan a character and like in theory, but I find that it's when I start writing dialogue, that is when they really come to life, and that's when I start understanding them. So actually, when I write synopsis, I learned by experience to put in pieces of dialogue, because if I don't, they may surprise me. They may not behave the way I have planned them to. So characters are developed gradually throughout the writing. Of course, I do have, in order for them to do what I've planned them to do, they have to obey me at a certain level. But yeah, I think the sort of the detailed personality only comes to life through writing.
So we just had a really fascinating conversation off air before we started with Joe about some Norwegian pronunciation. So I go into this next question with a little bit of trepidation. But could you tell us about whether your process with your standalone novels is different to with the I'll give first the English and then I'll try the Norwegian. So with the Harry Hole novels, and then I think in Norwegian, although do correct me here, it should be Harry Høle. But is that process? Talk us about the distinction between the series and the standalone.
It's not really that different. I mainly see myself as a storyteller, and I just happen to, tell some of my stories within the genre of crime fiction, or the, a mix between the hard-boiled American detective stories from the 50s and 60s, and the more modern Scandinavian crime novel. That is the genre. And like I said, to me, the boundaries of genres are more inspiring, and I love to try to be creative within, and it helps me being creative to have those boundaries. And so when I go to a standalone story, like a thriller, like Headhunters, there's also tradition that I can use there, and I also find rules by which to play the game. When writing children's books, there are also rules and boundaries that help me. The difference is probably more that writing a Harry Hole novel, it's a big plot, it's a gallery of so many characters, so it feels more like conducting a symphony orchestra, while writing, for example, a children's book. It's more about improvising. It's more like playing a gig for four-piece band and improvising more. But it's not like one is easier or harder than the other. It's just slightly different. And by the end of the day, you have to have a story there. You have to something that will make you and hopefully your readers curious.
When it comes to crime fiction, what are some of the rules in particular that you find helpful to play with or work within?
Well, I think for me, in the Harry Hole series, it's mainly the who's done it stories. And then it's about manipulating your readers. You have that license to mislead your readers, but being fair. That is like, when looking back, I gave you all the clues. So hopefully, so that when you get the solution, hopefully you're not going, what? But you're going, oh, yes, of course, after having thought about it for a couple of seconds. And in that respect, I work a bit like comedians. I think I asked a comedian, what do you mean by timing? And he said that people think that the punchline has to come as a surprise to the audience, but it's the other way around. You give them what they half expect, they just haven't realized yet. So you give them the punchline, the obvious punchline, a fraction of a second before they come to that same conclusion. So they laugh because they understand. They don't laugh because they are surprised. Chaos is not funny, and chaos is not satisfying in a crime novel either. It's a satisfying thing is to, feeling intelligent, feeling that, yeah, of course, I would have realized that if you'd just given me a little more time.
Could we roll back now to earlier in your life and how your writing career came about? And you had a varied route to this. You played football at a high level, you've been a musician, you've worked in finance, and then we understand that the first Harry Hole novel was commissioned originally as a kind of tour memoir for your career as a musician. Could you just take us back to how this all began for you?
Yeah, I was, like you said, I worked as a financial analyst, and at the same time I played with my band, and we had a sort of a sudden success with an album, and so I ended up playing with my band more than 100 gigs a year, but keeping my day job, which was more or less impossible. I was, at the end of that year, I was more or less burnt out, so I said to my boss at the brokerage firm that I had to have a long vacation. So I took 6 months off, and I went to Australia with a friend of mine, and he was only there for 2 weeks, so he had to go back. So I figured I had to do something when he was gone. And I had been asked by a girl who worked at a publishing house who I knew from university, and she had asked me to write something about the band. And I said, I won't do that, but since you ask you, maybe I'll write something else for you. And I knew I wanted to write a novel. I didn't know I wanted to write a crime novel, but I had only a few weeks in which to write something for the publishing house. So I figured out, okay, I'll write something where I know the head and the tail of the animal, and that's a crime novel. And because I had seen so many of my friends who wanted to be novelists, trying to write the big European novel at their first attempt, and were never able to finish that. So in 5 weeks' time, I wrote, I actually wrote the first novel in the Harry Hole series, having no idea it was going to get published. For me, I thought of it more as a test piece, that hopefully they liked it and they would invite me to write something else for them. But when I got back and I sent them the first version, after a few weeks, they phoned me and said that they wanted to publish it. And I was a bit shocked, because I didn't think I hadn't put enough work into it. So I said, can I have it back and rewrite it? And they said, no, well, we're in a bit of a hurry. We are going to publish it this fall. So I got it back and I reworked it a little bit, but it ended up being the first novel in the series, The Batman.
I read as well that you weren't that interested in crime fiction as a child. So what made you sure that you could pull it off?
Yeah, well, it depends on what you define as a crime novel. To me, Mark Twain's Tom Sawyer is a murder mystery. So in that respect, I was interested in suspense, and I was interested in great characters. And even as a child, I can remember my mother told me that she got a phone from a worried teacher because we had an essay in school. I think the title was A Nice Day in the Woods. And everybody would put in, short stories about that. Mine was like 20 pages long. And it was a nice day in the woods, only in my story, nobody came back alive. And so I probably had it in me from a young age. But as a reader, I was, especially in my late teens, I got interested in, the classics. I started reading, Hemingway, Charles Bukowski, Jack Kerouac. So I wasn't really into any of the crime writers. I wasn't a big fan of Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett, really. Until I wasn't into crime novels until I found Jim Thompson. And Jim Thompson wrote in the 50s and the 60s, and these really dark stories. The Killer Inside Me and Population 1280. That was, to me, the American Psycho, written 30 years before Bret Easton Ellis did so. And so yeah, Jim Thompson, he inspired me too. And also later, graphic novelist Frank Miller with his Sin City stories also inspired me.
Could we talk about Harry as a character now? We recently had Lee Child on the show, and we're talking to him about Jack Reacher, and he was saying, that for him, Reacher is a kind of solid construction. Like, he doesn't have an arc. He doesn't have what he's going to do. He will prevail and he will win, and it's not about kind of journey or growth. And you've described Harry as a genuine anti-hero, saying that he has a strong moral conviction, but you are interested in moral ambiguity. And we wonder kind of where that came from, and particularly this thing about finding out about your father's experiences in the Second World War. Could you tell us about that? And just also, I'm fascinated with the language thing. If you could also tell us, our listeners, correctly how his name would be pronounced as a Norwegian, that would be brilliant.
Yeah, well, in Norwegian, his name is Harry Hole. Hole being a common Norwegian name, but in the first novel he's traveling to Australia, so I gave him that name to have the sort of slightly embarrassing confusion when he's coming to Australia, how to pronounce his name. Well, unlike some characters in series where the character is always sort of back to status quo at the start of a new book, Harry is going through. I mean, he's evolving both as a person and physically. He's getting older, he's getting injured. So in many ways, the series of Harry Hole is the story, the tragedy of a character slowly falling apart. And I think that is his moral dilemmas is what is driving the story. In the first two novels, he was like the camera eye, but from the third novel, he moved in front of the camera. So Harry's life and his own moral choices became, the issues center stage. And that's what I find interesting, in writing these kind of stories set in the crime fiction tradition, moral dilemmas that we all can relate to, and having the reader, making Harry's choices for him, rooting for one choice, Harry probably making the other choice, but still persuading the readers to go with him whatever dark alley he is going down.
And how does that growth work in terms of being part of a series, but also each novel being able to be read on its own? How do you calibrate that?
Well, first of all, I wrote a long storyline for Harry when I wrote the third novel in the series, The Redbreast. And when I'm saying that Harry is slowly falling apart, that is true. I mean, the world around him is falling apart, but simultaneously, he learning to bond with people. He's kind of learning to love, I guess. His experiences in life has been that whenever he has loved somebody, whether it's his mother, a colleague, or a girlfriend, they have been taken away from him. So he feels that his love is like a vampire's bite. But slowly he's returning to humanity, to be one of them, I guess.
Could you tell us now about your writing routine? We saw that with The Bat, you turned this around in 5 weeks, but also that you go regularly to Thailand for a few months each year. How does your routine work, and is it consistent or does it vary between the books?
It both varies and it's the same. I don't have any routines really. When I started writing, I felt so privileged because I had the time to write. So I always felt when sitting down typing that it was my time off. And I'm sort of clinging to that illusion that writing is something I get to do when I have nothing else to do. And so my life is not centered around writing. It's actually more centered around rock climbing, which I do a lot, and which is why I started going to Thailand, to this beautiful peninsula where they have rock climbing, and playing with my band. And so when I have time off, I sit down with my laptop and I write. And it's not something I have to force myself to do. I'm lucky in the way that I love writing, and I would probably write even if I wasn't published. I think it's just I just love the process of developing stories into novels or short stories or lyrics for a song.
Do the words come easily when you're writing? And in particular, when you're writing sort of violent scenes, how do you find that experience? We interviewed also Irvin Welsh on the show, who says he sometimes is horrified thinking about his mother or his partner reading his work and thinking, what on earth is this? Is that something that you also share?
Yeah. Well, my mother made that much easier for me. I mean, my father, he passed away before I wrote my first novel, and my mother, who is a librarian and a great reader, she told me, after my first novel, she had phoned her sister who had read the book, and my mother asked her, is it good? And mom said, yeah, it's good, you can read it. Yeah, but is it sex in it? Yeah, there's some sex. Oh, then I can't read it. I can't read my son writing about sex. And she told me that I want the book, I want it in my shelf, but I won't read it. And I said, that's fine. Actually, that's perfect. Then I don't have to think about you reading this.
Could you tell us about your thoughts on the crime genre in particular? And with other writers operating in this space in English, or initially English language writers we've had on the show, I'm thinking of some people like Val McDermid. They talked a lot about how the way that crime writing, at least in Britain, is perceived has changed a lot over the past 2 decades. That it's seen as a kind of more respectable genre, that it's that there's less stigma attached to it. How has that functioned for you in Scandinavia, but also more broadly? Is the sort of social position of crime writing different in the Nordic countries?
I think maybe it was a bit different early on. I mean, back in the 70s, there were two Swedish writers, Sjöwall and Wahlöö, used the crime novel for their, well, partly for their political agenda. They were left-wing writers, but more importantly, they were really good writers. So they sort of brought crime novel from the kiosks into the serious bookstores. And they started this tradition of good, talented writers using the crime novel to, criticize society. And it made a lot of talented writers using the crime genre. Now, there was in the 80s and 90s probably just as many bad crime novels produced in Scandinavia as anywhere else. But there were just so many writers using the crime genre. So there were bound to be some really good writers. And if you look at other Scandinavian writers like Henning Mankell and probably more famously Stig Larsson, they would use a crime novel also to criticize society. So it was, I wouldn't say that crime novel is like a highbrow novel in Scandinavia, but what you see is that many of the more literary writers, they will at one time or another have a go at the crime novel. So it's not considered lowbrow or, well, I mean, it is low. You definitely have lowbrow crime novels in Scandinavia also, but it doesn't need to be.
It seems like the community of crime writers is really supportive of each other, and it seems to be that people sort of blurb and promote each other's work. What's your experience of that been like?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that, there is, I guess, some sort of competition, but I think that crime writers in general, or writers in general, our competitors are more, TV and movies, other kinds of entertainment than novels. I think it's whenever you have a blockbuster novel, it's helpful for any writer because it makes people read, and that is not something you can take for granted nowadays.
We are thrilled to announce the publication of Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers. The book, edited by the two of us, features contributions from almost 100 past guests on the podcast. It's a distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 6 years.
The book offers, we think, frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Published by Ithaca Press, Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers is available now in all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
Could you tell us about your children's books and how that project came about, and then why you've decided to have these parallel tracks of writing for children as well as writing adult fiction?
Yeah, well, I think you can probably guess how I came about writing children's books. I had a daughter, so I had to write something for her. Well, I did tell her stories from a young age. Actually, I was more or less her jukebox. She, instead of putting coins on the jukebox, she would give me, elements that she wanted in the story. Like, I want a princess, a little boy, a crazy professor, and a dinosaur and a potato in the story. And then I had to come up with something, improvise there and then. And one summer I came up with a story about Dr. Proctor, a crazy inventor who invented the fart powder, very powerful one. And it became a hilarious story when I told her, and I realized that, this is probably could be a funny children's book. And so it became the start of a series of 5 books about Dr. Proctor.
I'd also read the one about the princess, the potato, the dinosaur, and the other elements. How do you, as you were writing that series, how did you sort of test it? Obviously, you had your daughter, but how did you sort of write for that different audience? Was it just that you were steeped in what children found funny, or were you also writing to amuse yourself?
I wrote actually what I found funny, and and I consciously didn't, stupid down the language. I guess the language is slightly challenging for children, so I think I wanted to write when they promoted the book, a book for smart children, which would which would certainly be a good tagline, I guess. But it's like, and the reason why I did that is that remembering from my childhood, listening to the grown-ups telling stories, and I didn't understand everything in the stories, but I kind of understand that it was supposed to be funny, and I would laugh and find it entertaining just for the feeling of it being funny somehow, without me really understanding why it was funny. And I think the Dr. Proctor books, they are a little bit the same. They are not meant. They are not stories from an adult to another adult, but still there is an element of trying to make the adults smile and laugh as well.
It's a rule of the podcast that we always ask about money and how it's interacted with people's writing lives. So be as open or as guarded as you're comfortable with. But how has the financial element of your writing career worked, and when was it clear to you that this was something that was going to be a profitable endeavor for you to do?
Well, I guess for me it was a bit different than for most writers, because I had a job as a financial analyst and option broker. So I made more money than I was worth already, in a way. And when I decided I don't want to work in finance, I want to be a writer. I had for some years considered being a full-time musician, and so I had paid for my apartment. I owned my own apartment, and I had some money, so I figured when I decided I want to be a writer that I didn't have to make money for 5 years. And I wanted to have that money because I knew that I'd seen so many musicians having to compromise to pay the rent, starting out with a love for music and love for their idea of the project that they wanted to pursue, and ending up doing stuff that they really didn't want, and in the end they would hate being musicians. So I figured, okay, I will not end up there. So when I started writing, my eyes was not at the prize or at the prize money. It was just at creating this story that I wanted to tell, and knowing I could return to finance if I had to. And it wasn't until I wrote my third novel I knew that I could make a living as a full-time writer. And actually the third novel was so successful that I knew that I probably didn't have to write stuff to suit my audience in order to pay the rent. And I wouldn't have done that either way. But I think, as a writer, I think you probably should. For me, it's like opening my home and say that, this is where I live. This is my universe. This is the music we play here. This is the food I serve. This is what you get. And if it's not to your liking, you're free to go somewhere else. It's not like I can't visit you where you live and try to give you the things I think you want. Actually, I think you can tell if writers are trying to do that. So all you can do is to write stuff that interests you, things you are curious about. And if you're lucky, there's a lot of people who are interested in the same things. And if not, well, then you have to live off your savings, but at least you're happy doing what you're doing.
You mentioned the third book. Was that when things sort of really exploded, or had the first two also been successful enough that you just had the courage of your conviction by then?
Well, the first book was received good reviews and also a couple of prestigious prizes, but it didn't sell that much. And then with my second novel, which is probably the novel I was least happy with, it sold more. And then it was the third novel, that was The Redbreast, that was both a success with the critics and the audience. That was when I knew that, okay, seems like I'm going to do this for a long, long time.
Another point that we've raised and often had really interesting conversations with with authors who've sold huge numbers of books is what has been the reaction of sort of so-called literary novelists, or and even whether they think there's a divide between these two kinds of fiction. We've heard often about kind of complicated kind of two-way envy that goes between best-selling writers and very highbrow writers, but also about quite productive interactions between them. What has been your experience of that? Has there been envy, or has it been a sort of easier thing to deal with?
I don't really socialize that much with writers. I spent time with the friends I had when I was young and when I was a student, and none of them are writers. So I only meet other writers, at some festivals, and I don't go much to festivals either, and writers' events. I'm probably lucky that there's a few literary writers like Per Pettersson, for example, that is giving me praise, for my writing. So I haven't really noticed, but I do think that there is a slight irritation that crime writers in general sell so many books, and that there are so many bad books that become bestsellers. And I can, to a certain extent, I can understand, and I share that irritation to a certain extent. On the other hand, from time to time, you see other kind of writers, literary writers, like Karl Ove Knausgård, for example, had this, really ambitious, experimental series of books writing just about his own life that became an instant bestseller in Norway, topping all the lists. And that is so, inspiring and reassuring as a writer, that if it's good enough, you can top the bestseller lists writing in any genre.
I read somewhere that you sell a book every 23 seconds. Is that true?
Every I think now it's down to every 20 seconds, actually.
Shaving a second off every year.
No, I have no idea. I saw they used that in UK some years back. Yeah.
And where are your biggest markets? Like, where does your fiction do best?
Well, it's Norway first of all, and then it's the rest of Europe, actually, including UK, yeah.
There's been a lot of interest in your work from Hollywood, including an adaptation of The Snowman. You're not very involved in those projects. Why is it that you wanted to keep a bit of distance from them?
Well, I've written a novel. The novel is there. I don't see, and for me, a movie doesn't need to be a version of the book. I see my book more as hopefully useful input for talented directors to make their own story. And so, like with Snowman, which didn't turn out the way any of us hoped, it was at the start, but the director, Thomas Alfredsson, a very talented director, he asked me, is it okay if I tell my story? And I told him that, yeah, I want you to tell your story. The novel is there. I've done my job. Now if you can use it to make a good movie, you're free to do whatever you want. And that is the way I see it. The movie is such a different medium, and there's nothing holy about the stuff in my novels. I'm just trying to write good stories, and I hope directors are trying to create good stories also.
I was very interested to see your interest in rock climbing. It's something that's important to me as well, and I'm writing a book about ski mountaineering and stuff. But could you talk a bit about, the relationship between your climbing and your writing? And I was interested in seeing a video about you trying to do an 8A, that you'd actually never done a multi-pitch route, that it was you were kind of devoted to single pitch climbing. Tell us about how that came about, and if there is a relationship between your climbing career and your writing career.
I think there is no connection at all between my writing and my rock climbing. It's like when people are trying to make metaphors about football and life. To me, that always sounds stupid. First of all, football is about football, and rock climbing for me it's great because it's a break from everything else. It's a break from writing, from playing, from working, from your love life and your frustrations. And I'm slightly scared of heights. So when I climb, I can't think about anything else but the next move and the wall. I started climbing quite late in life, and it wasn't until I was 50 years old that I really got seriously involved with rock climbing. I do mainly sports climbing, meaning and it's like the 100 meters sprint of rock climbing. So it's hard climbs, steep climbs, maybe 30 meters. And then you lower down and you can have your lunch safely on the ground, and go home for dinner. That's the climbing I prefer. But some years ago, I wanted to write about climbing, and I wanted to write about Lynn Hill. She was the first climber to climb the nose in Yosemite. And so I decided, in order to get inside her head, putting up a project like that seemed almost impossible, I wanted to do the same for myself. So I decided I wanted to do everything I could to train for 2 years to climb a route of the grade 8A, which when I was 19 years old, that was the hardest route climbed in the world. Now, climbing has developed a lot since then. People train differently. You have indoor gyms where you can train. So nowadays it's not a miracle when somebody climb an 8A. But for me, since I had started climbing so late, that was a big challenge. So I put 2 years into that, and I trained every day. I ate and slept, and I had a trainer who had trained the national Norwegian team, who happened to be a friend of mine. So we worked really hard while I was writing about climbing and why we climb, and why we try to, achieve a goal like that has no meaning to anybody else but yourself. And to me, that was a way back to my childhood, to playing, to just, because climbing like that is like a bunch of kids pointing to the top of the tree, saying, let's see if anybody can climb to the top of that tree. So it was back to that playfulness. After 2 years, I still haven't achieved my goal, but I was so close that I decided to give it another year. And then earlier this year, I finally climbed my 8A project. Yeah, you're right. I haven't climbed multi-pitches until 2 weeks ago, actually, in Norway. I talked to one of the legends of Norwegian climbing and climbing in general, Ralph Høybakk, who was the first Norwegian to be on the top of Mount Everest. And he's 86 years old now. And he had the first ascent of a famous route, in six-pitch route in Norway. So I said, are you ready to go and re-climb that route? And he was. And it was really wonderful experience to climb with this legend. And it's slab, so it's not that physically hard, but it's mentally, it's just crazy. And to see him like a ballet dancer, 86 years old, dancing up that route, it was just amazing. So yes, we did our six-pitch routes, and I'm so happy to have done that, because there was trad climbing, slab, and I'm never, ever going to do it again.
That sounds fair enough. As someone who's also quite scared of heights, I will not be going up any mountains. We're coming towards the end of our time, so I wanted to ask about the Harry Hole Foundation. When did you set it up, and what made you want to do it?
I think from an early age, I spent all my money traveling. From when I was 17 years old, I would save money throughout the year so I could go traveling. So at the age of 20-something, I had seen most of Europe and some other parts of the world also. And what I had learned from my travels was that it wasn't the other countries that were exotic. It was Norway that was exotic. Norway was the different country. It was a country where when you are born, you are safe, you can live a life without starving. You will have free education. You have all the things you need to have a good life. And so when I earned more money than I needed at a point, I decided that I didn't need or even want a yacht or something, but that I could hopefully put up a foundation that would contribute to the fight against illiteracy in third world countries. And we've been doing that now for 15 years. The money is from royalties from the books I've written. So by now we have, I think, 16 million euros. And it's being used to educate young people. For the next 5 years, it will be mainly girls in African countries.
I wanted to ask about your future plans for Harry Hole. And again, with Lee Child as a kind of interesting point of comparison, who we spoke to recently, who's handed the Jack Reacher franchise over to his brother. You've said that, that is not what you're going to do. He's not immortal. You're not going to try and resurrect him or hand him over. What are your thoughts on the correct, or for you, the best way to bring a series like that to a conclusion?
For me, it was, like I said, Harry is evolving, developing as a character. So it's a sort of a logic end to that story. And of course, I won't reveal how it's going to end. But for me, it would be, I would definitely not have anyone trying to resurrect Harry or just because it's a profitable trademark name. So like we've seen happen with the Stieg Larsson books in Sweden, I think that is really sad, and I will make sure that is not going to happen with my book. On the other hand, you could have, if you want to have a character, if you want that character to have a life after you have passed away yourself, that's perfectly okay. If that is your intention, then do that.
And as a final question, are there any projects that you hope to work on in the near future, either within the Harry Hole series or children's books or screenplays or anything else?
Well, actually, right now I'm working on The Night House, on a script for a movie for The Night House. So we will see how that goes.
And as a final question from me, just a quick one, could you tell the listeners how your name should be pronounced in Norwegian? You've been very tolerant with us butchering these things, but just it would be great to end on that.
In Norway, they call me Jo Nesbø.
That's very good. Thank you very much indeed, and wishing you all the best.
Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Jo Nesbø. His website is jonesbø.com, and The Night House is published by Havelseka. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway on the interview with Jo?
I thought Jo was a great guest. He was very lively and funny. It always surprises me the similes or metaphors that writers draw about writing, and in his case, the similarities between writing and comedy, and the importance of expected surprise. I also thought the episode was an interesting contrast with The Child, particularly on the Hollywood point, and that Jo is not very involved and Lee very much is. And also it was interesting that Jo is a rare plotter for sort of mystery, horror, thriller writers. They're often people that just like to jump in and see what happens to try and sustain that sense of adrenaline. But in his case, has a slightly different method. So it was good to hear about his process. How about you?
I thought he was very tolerant at my slightly cringy attempts to pin down an authentic Norwegian pronunciation of his name. I thought it was very interesting to hear from someone who'd achieved a kind of level of, if not, international, but, reasonable national success in one medium of music, and then moving out into another world, and then, also moving internationally. And I'm not sure, we haven't had that many, non-English language native speaker writers on the show. I'm not sure we've had any, actually. So it was a kind of interesting point in that way. And I was also extremely impressed by his level of sport climbing prowess. I think he told us that he'd climbed something in the eighth grade, which was very impressive. And again, the perennial point I make about, it's just interesting to peel back what massive international literary success is like from the inside out. So a really good addition to our catalogue. Anyway, Rachel, what have you been up to, and what has your cultural diet been?
So after my cuteness piece, I'm moving on to something completely different in tone. I'm going to do something about the Magdalene laundries in Ireland. And I also have various book reviews. I think I signed up to about 3 in March, so I'm going to have to get reading. So yes, it's busy, but that's good. And in terms of things I've been reading, I've just started the third sort of iteration, because it's not full seasons, but the third bit of Lupin on Netflix. And I've also just started reading The Green Dot, a novel by Madeline Gray. So
across all formats and nationalities of content, Rachel.
I'm trying, but it's too soon for both of those to report back. So I'll let you know in the next installment what I made of them. What have you been up to and consuming?
I've come back to the UK for 2 weeks, and I've basically just slept for 2 days. I was so tired. But it's nice to be back. In terms of cultural stuff, I had this, I don't know if I mentioned this in the previous episode, I think it was about to come out, but I had a long read in The Guardian, my profile of a Swiss extreme skier called Jeremy Heitz that came out that I was really pleased with. It got a really good response. It was selected, picked by Longreads, picked by the Sunday Long Read, bounced around a lot on social media. And it was also just a very pleasant experience. I was working with an American editor who I'll name check happily, a guy called Bobby Baird, who was extremely pro to work with. And it just all came together very well. And a few, interesting things that come my way on the back of it. So that's been good. I finished reading my biography of a French extreme skier called Sylvain Saudin, and I'm now reading a book called Staying Alive in Avalanche Terrain, which is possibly the most sort of on-the-nose title that I've ever read. So I'm basically having to just read a lot of stuff related to my book. And I did find today, I got back and suddenly there were like novels on my bookshelf that I really wanted to get into. And at the moment I just don't really have time for non-reading related to that, which is a bit of a grind. I also watched the next episode of Masters of the Air, which is being drip-fed out slowly. And I don't know yet whether they have boldly killed a central character. I felt maybe they had, but maybe they hadn't. So
which actor is that?
The one who was in Elvis.
Austin Butler, yeah.
He has failed to return, but I suspected there might be some now we cut to like a field in occupied Belgium and he's sort of wiping the mud off his forehead and there he's doing. So I don't know whether it was a sort of bold thing, but I felt the previous episode actually got a little bit lost. But I could speak for 50 minutes about World War II drama series, so I think I'm going to restrain myself on that. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acombe.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin, our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.